Good evening, everybody. I propose that we start now. It is a few minutes late, but that allowed everybody to join us. I'm happy to be welcoming you in the name of ICOM France this evening for our first cycle on sustainable development and the environment. This is a project that we designed to be as open as possible, facing a real need that we feel between museum professionals to communicate and get mutual inspiration in order to change our way of working. The principles of these sessions are quite simple. We want to invite 3 to 5 museum professionals to share their experience and thoughts on a specific topic each time. Let me give you the overall program later. And at the end of the session, we will be leaving time and space for questions and answers. You can ask these in the chat, but also encourage you to also speak up after the meeting. We're hoping that this will be as dynamic as possible. So after the presentations, please do engage in the questions and answers. So there are 6 sessions that are going to be spread throughout the year from today right up to November. The program is available on our website. Allow me to remind you. So this first session is about sustainable architecture and built heritage. The second session held on the 7th of June is going to be on mediation of sustainable development. The third on the 5th of July about societal perspectives on sustainable development. The fourth session, we're going to be having a break in August, and we will be having another session on the 27th of September about training and research. On the 18th of October, we're going to be studying digital technologies and sustainable development, and we'll be finishing up on the 22nd of November on the issue of urgency and reconstruction. So any presentation shared will be published. As you can see, there's a real library of publications from ICOM France behind me. These presentations will be available in paper format. And for those of you unable to go onto ICOM France's YouTube channel, everything will be recorded and everything is translated as well into the 3 ICOM languages. I thank the interpreters in advance. I really do need to take some time to thank everybody. I need to remind you that ICOM France has not been managing this by itself. So I would like to thank the partners, the ICOM national committees, ICOM Spain, ICOM Lebanon, ICOM Canada, ICOM LAC, ICTOP, ICOM CC, and the University of Quebec has also joined this group and is represented here today. I would also like to thank the moderators of this evening, Ann Bourgès, and we really did want to include her from ICOMOS, the International Council on Monuments and Sites, so she has quite unique insight in this issue, and Hélène Vassal, who has been working with Sandrine Bourgès on the design of this cycle. I would also like to thank Alexia and Claude Maurice, who you will not be seeing necessarily, but they have played a vital role in all of the activities surrounding these sessions. I'm not going to waste any further time, and I'm going to hand over to Anne and Hélène and our speakers, who I would also like to warmly thank for their involvement in this project. I wish you all an excellent evening. Thank you so much, Emily. I would just like to say a little before handing over to our colleague Ann Bourgès, who will be introducing this cycle of 4 presentations followed by a second part of the evening, as you presented, Emily. We really are expecting reactions and questions from all of the participants this evening. We've decided to launch this cycle on sustainable architecture and built heritage. It's natural to talk about buildings right from the start. This is the envelope that's protecting our collections. Environmental concerns mean that we need to think about our relationship to conservation differently, as this can sometimes be a source of contradiction. I hope that this evening will form the basis of this discussion and give us sources of inspiration through examples of projects with a systemic approach in order to propose the best strategies and tools. The art of architecture, by definition, is one of compromise and adaptation. Allow me to start this cycle by citing Nicolas, who says that we need to embrace complexity. Thank you so much for all being here this evening. I see that we are already 78 people on this call, and I'm going to hand over to Ann Bourgès now. Thank you. Thank you so much, Hélène. Good evening, everybody. It is a real pleasure to be working with ICOM France and to moderate this session alongside Hélène Vassal. I am representing ICOMOS France, particularly the Climate Change Working Group, which was created in June 2021. This follows on from what we have already been doing with the International Climate Change and Heritage Working Group, which is currently working on developing monitoring units on heritage sites in order to assess the impact on climate change on a number of these sites. Conducting a number of different assessments. So climate change has already had impacts on communities, heritage at a global scale, and the trends are getting worse. We want to help our heritage to adapt positively to climate change through maintenance. A lot of our heritage, both natural, cultural and museum heritage, is facing risks associated with climate change, and we need to mitigate those risks, but also adapt in order to ensure the sustainability of our heritage. Action and reimagining are now the stage that we're in. This is essential. There are international symposiums for in March 2022 under the French presidency of the European Union in order to highlight the need for dialogue between science, particularly digital technologies, and the monitoring of cultural and natural sites and heritage sites. We will only be able to do this by identifying vulnerability and developing new tools, digital tools, and methodologies. It is essential today to adapt. We need to implement measurement systems. We're going to be looking at this evening for sites that have been identified as sensitive with the increase in temperatures, intensifications of cycles of drought, and also excess moisture, contamination of pollutants, soils, and this can also impact our collections across the world. Today, we need to understand how to restore and what the impact of this restoration will be. For this, we need measurements. We need to be measuring buildings. Buildings are an envelope, as Ellen said. We need to understand it, understand how it works, so that we can use it to block out the external climate conditions. We're going to be using a number of technological issues and solutions in line with regulations. We're hoping that this session will give us an opportunity to share different points of views from our different working groups through methodology that will be implementing diagnostics for true restoration and reflection on adaptive behavior that can go hand in hand with innovation and adaptation to climate change. We're trying to develop a true management plan. That's what we'll be looking at this evening in order to support our collections, support protection, but also with scalable solutions that will strike the right balance between sustainability and preservation of the collections. We need to be identifying new opportunities for buildings. Preservation is a green action. I say it a lot. Conservation may not be in itself, but how can we do it for the best in a sustainable way while minimizing its negative impact? So we need to be measuring our impact in order to optimize and promote our collections. By achieving true resilience, we're going to be able to hear this evening a number of different examples in order to illustrate what I've just said. Let us start with the talk by Annelies Cosaert. She works at the Royal Institute for Cultural Heritage in Belgium, working to conserve heritage in Belgium. Annelies has worked for many years at the Department of Preventive Conservation at the Royal Institute for Cultural Heritage. She is specialized in glass, ceramics, and metal, with a short-term focus on conservation of collections. She will be talking particularly about the Climate to Preserve project, which helps museums integrate short and long-term energy-saving measures. I'm going to hand straight over to Annelies.
Thank you, Annelies. I don't know whether to speak French or English, but it's fine. You can speak in English. That's in French. That's absolutely fine. It's just I had my slides in English and I couldn't handle the two different languages. So thank you for this very interesting presentation, which really shows us the use of interdisciplinary tools and the possibility of online tools. And it also shows us the feasibility of putting this kind of tool online, how it can be shared in an interactive way, so that it can be used by everyone. So perhaps I'll just keep my questions for later on, but this idea of this kind of tool is really very interesting, and this from a methodological perspective in order to generate climates and assess climates within museums. So we could also think about how we manage collections in these kind of situations. Should we prioritize particular collections for particular climatic conditions? That would be a question that we could look into. So that's a really good connection with the next presentation from Danilo Forleo. Danilo is a researcher with responsibility for the preventive conservation of the collections of the Château de Versailles. He's a graduate in preventive conservation of heritage from the Sorbonne University in Paris. He has, since 2015, been setting up and directing the European research program EPICO, the European Protocol in Preventive Conservation. And this is the project that he's going to present to us now and talk about the methodology that has been put in place and look at these different set points for conservation and compare them with real set points in the Château of Versailles. So over to Danilo.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you to all of the organizers for this excellent opportunity to share. I'm going to be sharing this tool, which is a decision-making tool for preventive conservation in historic houses, EPICO. I will be discussing this theme today, and more precisely the method for ensuring the right temperature for conservation of collections. This can have a significant impact in terms of energy conservation, CO2 emissions. One of the questions that I wanted to ask is, could we imagine the blackening of a stone due to pollution? Could we imagine using a dehumidifier within conservations? We can see in the literature that climate change is echoing what we're seeing on the ground in Versailles, with alterations to collections that are very susceptible to extreme climate change. I'll be able to give you some examples later on. Since 2015, we've had a more systemic approach, particularly with EPICO, with our historic monument through a European network. This has allowed us to work with 5 different European countries, which has helped us to collect data in order to give us a statistically relevant overview of what's happening. The interesting point that I would like to discuss is air treatment, air processing in museums, which can lead to the emission of greenhouse gases through human activities. And we know that this can play a significant role in the local climate. So air conditioning and heating leads to significant levels of greenhouse gas emissions. The question of how to conserve our collections is important because it requires specific situations. We know that we can have energy savings through not air conditioning so much in the summer, but on the other hand, if we are not using air conditioning in museums, monuments and churches, etc., we can damage the state of collections. But inversely, if we are over air conditioning, then it is going to be wasting energy. So we need to be overcoming this dichotomic approach with conservation on one side and sustainable development in the environment on the other. And I think we are going to need to be working closely with scientists in order to strike the correct balance. Moving on to my next slide now, there is a new mentality approach here. This is ICOM study museums faced with their environmental and societal responsibilities. This is based on knowledge of the state of the collections. This needs to be identified, and we need to be able to hold in balance all of these different components through a systemic approach. This is what we have tried to do with the ICOM research project. Let me move on to the next slide now. I would like to give a concrete example. This is the Queen's Chamber from the Château de Versailles. Work has been carried out in 2014 in order to secure some of the networks. Before this work, the conservation department had identified a number of different measurements, including objects in the Queen's Chamber. One of the most precious and most important objects in the Château de Versailles, you can see towards the back left of the image there. And this is the most prestigious part. The state of this space needs to be conserved properly. Paradoxically, you can see in the image is that there is a non-compliant climatic state of the museum, with exhibitions facing south with large windows and temperatures exceeding 30 degrees. We have up to 10,000 visitors per day. The conditions survey led to thermohydraulic studies of the temperature and humidity. And we need to ensure that the building is not weakening. We need significant airflow in the space. This led to the development of recommendations for conservation in terms of the climate control within the rooms. The museum director decided to work on increasing knowledge through research, which has been carried out by EPICO. Successive studies and application of this method has allowed us to extend the threshold of tolerance and to minimize the invasiveness of climate control mechanisms. If you, as you will see here about the European Protocol in Preventative Conservation for Historic Houses, EPICO, it is based on 5 main criteria specific to historic houses and the exhibitions shown in these spaces. The works are generally more linked to the spaces in which they are presented. There is therefore a relationship between the state of collections and the state of the building that's easier to establish. There is a cause and effect relationship, and this is very important. This is one of the most important criteria for us, I would say. This needs to be replicable and transferable to other historic houses, obviously. In the next slide, you can see a fairly classic example from this systemic approach, comparative approach between collection, the assessment of the state of collections, and the risk assessment, which is based on a number of different symptoms associated with collections. The latest program for 2022-2024 will allow us to identify shared strategies with the various partners of the program in order to support partners facing issues associated with climate change and increasing temperatures. The climate impact is able to be isolated since 2015. We want to consolidate data, particularly digital data. At the moment, we have dispersed databases, and we want to be able to bring this all together within digital databases under the Ministry of Culture. Between 2023 and 2025, we have work ongoing between a number of different palaces across France and Monaco in order to establish some foundations in order to mitigate the effects of climate change on the collections, like I said, whilst also decreasing energy consumption. I'm going to wrap up with the following slide. There will be special attention paid to traditional maintenance and conservation practices in order to integrate them with new technologies. We believe that these traditional methods that are recommended in a number of different studies at a national and international level, this is encouraged. We've already experienced this in Versailles. We've seen how these two variables can coexist correctly. Let me give you examples such as passive systems with windows, but also insulation that we can use through technical methods in order to reduce the temperature. Whether in Versailles or in France, and more generally, are we using these traditional methods? Could we imagine as visitors visiting a museum, a home that is heated between 15 and 17 degrees in order to save energy? Thank you for your opinions on this and for listening to my presentation today. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Danilo, Forleo. We have a number of questions that I think we're going to ask you already. Anne, could you perhaps share these? There are two questions. The first is for our first speaker and also for Danilo. Could museums that are less advanced benefit from a shared methodology? So could you as a larger institution help smaller institutions through this? Yes, we have designed the EPICO methodology to be transferable. It has been designed on Excel sheets that can be shared easily. The aim is to use the support of the Ministry of Culture to build an online platform which would be freely accessible so that everybody can benefit from this without the transfer of files, which would be quite difficult. This is really what we're looking with the data science, open science, with research that is available to everybody and a much wider audience. Annelies, I don't know if you would like to answer that as well. Yes, of course. I do not think that there are museums that are less advanced. I just think that if you do not have a climatic system, if you do not have any kind of climate control, you're not going to be using energy. It's perhaps not applicable, but everything else could apply to any museum, whether it's just heating or whether it's for various levels of different gases. It could be interesting for this methodology, could be accessible to anybody. Yes, the methodology aims to consume less energy. So if you don't have a climate system, it's going to be difficult. So we have a kind of self-assessment system in place that you can do in order to identify the quantity of energy, if there's a large quantity of energy that could be saved. Or if on the other hand, there's little energy savings that you could make. It's to see if it's worth it price-wise. Yes, so working on the envelope is important, but it's good to see other ways that we could work. You were talking, Danilo, about traditional methods, and there's a question here. So what do you mean by traditional methods in order to control variations, minimize variations in terms of the humidity levels and temperature in establishments? Would you like me to answer that question? Yes, okay. I did give you some examples in the final slide. I think that the easiest to explain would be about light, even though there's whole books written about this, old books that we can find. And you can see that in the apartment of the Queen's Chamber on the second floor, we've tried to combine tech with technology by putting films on the window. So this filters part of the visible light. It's a high performance system that can reduce up to 40% of the solar energy coming in whilst leaving satisfactory aesthetic value. You cannot see that they're there. We've combined this system with reconstituted fabrics that would have been used in these kinds of buildings, such as net curtains or curtains. We have lined them with high-tech textiles that block out the light. We can modulate the different layers of the different layers of the different curtains in order to make them more or less opaque, to show that natural light, for example, is not just something aesthetic or historical that's important. for the spirit of the room, but it can actually be controlled using traditional methods in order to support light. So we can use artificial light less during the day, for instance, whilst moderating light filtration. We're experimenting with that at the moment, but there are so many different examples that I could explain. I think this is a great example. It's very similar to what we were saying in the introduction, using systems that already exist, so we don't need to modify them. We're using high-tech innovation alongside these traditional methods for the conservation of material methods. I think that light has an impact on temperature as well. So it is also going to be minimizing the amount of the temperature in the room as well, reducing that temperature. So it's going to improve the general climate in the building. This is just another example, another way that is just, we're combining here tradition and innovation, which I think is a direction that would be very helpful to move towards. Thank you very much. There is one final question about what about the staff working there if it's 16 degrees, but I think that's a question, but yes. Yes, it's a very delicate question, which is going to raise a lot of debates. I don't have any answers. I do have some examples. In the UK, they have made this decision in National Trust properties. They are obviously not subject to as many visitors as Versailles, but they have decided to reduce the heating. They provide correct clothing for the staff. I do not know what their response has been. I don't know if it is the solution, but in any case, it's important that we ask ourselves this question.
So yes, perhaps we should keep moving on because we've got a really good transition here with this question about traditional methods, because this is a subject that Ning Liu has been working on for some time. She's a member of the presidential program initiated by Jacques Chirac, 150 Chinese architects in France. She graduated from INSA Strasbourg and from the École Politique Fédérale de Lausanne with a doctorate. In 2011, she co-founded the agency Building for Climate in Paris. The agency's innovative practice consists of articulating environmental and cultural aspects in the expression of a new, more sustainable urban approach. She's led projects in France and also in China, Burkina Faso, Morocco, and South Africa. She has co-led 2 international urban planning workshops on resilience in Mayotte. She's also a member of the working group that you mentioned, Anne, on heritage and climate change of ICOMOS, and she's going to talk to us about her experience of renovating ancient centers. Thank you for being with us, Ning Liu. Thank you, Hélène, for that introduction. And since I'm speaking just after Danilo, and since this is an opportunity to travel through an ICOM meeting, I took this photo, which was taken by one of our research partners in Peking, in Beijing. So this is in the Forbidden City, and it perhaps talks about this, this responds to this big, the Château Museum of Versailles with the Chinese option. So here I want to talk about the architectural approach today. We've had colleagues who've shown a number of graphs and figures, but here I want to talk about the architectural approach. As architects, we have worked about the fundamentals of these different surveys, of doing very detailed work of building physicists. And now for over the last 10 years, I've been learning that this collaboration between architects and physicists of the buildings and conservators is really important to have this collaboration in order to preserve our ancient buildings. So why have we chosen the example of a museum like the Imperial Palace to talk about this story? It's because often heritage is not just about the collection that is there. When there are millions of visitors, they come also to see experience the envelope, the place. When people come to Versailles, the visitors want to see the conditions that the kings and queens of France lived in. In the same way, visitors that come to the Forbidden City are interested in seeing how people lived in the 1400s. The imperial family lived at this time. So this is perhaps has a real concentration of architecture and history in this place, and that's really what's really important for us as architects when we're dealing with this kind of subject. So if I can have the next slide. So the Forbidden City, it's really enormous. Here's just an extract of a part of the Forbidden City, which is called the Yangtze Palace. But this is a really important place just to the west of the central axis of the Forbidden City. This is where the emperors of the Qing dynasty lived with the empresses. And this is of traditional architecture with a lot of wood and a lot of bricks. There's a central space, which is the representation area, but there are also the spaces around it in this mini palace within a palace, which are living areas. And you can see it on the photos that I've taken from the site of the Palace Museum, that when you visit these spaces, it's also a visit, like when you visit the Queen's bedroom at Versailles. They're trying to maintain the state of conservation of this treasure, which really has an inestimable value for history. So recently within our research teams and our interdisciplinary research team, we've discovered that because of climate change and the effects of this climate change impacts on the monument, there's a number of problems that we're facing. So in Beijing, there are increasing problems of sudden rain, with a high quantity of rain falling in a very short period of time. And this is also creating problems in terms of drainage of water in big monuments such as this. So there can also be heat waves or peaks of heat or peaks of cold in the winter. And Danilo was talking about 16 degrees, but actually within this palace, we can see that the records of temperatures, because this palace is open, there's no doors. So we can see a change from 3 degrees to 27 degrees in terms of the changes of temperatures. And we are also seeing humidity and moisture causing condensation and mold. And so in order to maintain the palace in its good condition and enable visitors to see it in its best light, it really is a very detailed scientific work that's required. And this is really the invisible part of the work. So if you look at what we have on the slide here, you can see this archaeological work that's been carried out to see what you can see on the right, that the damage here is on the picture on the right is to do with intensification of weather issues, but also a lack of care and maintenance. There's a whole amount of research being done on drainage and also heating that has been used traditional methods, because in this part of China we use underfloor heating in the winter. Traditionally. So there's a whole lot of archaeological work for measuring and assessing risks and for mitigating issues in order to try and show the palace in its original light using contemporary technology and also the calculations of building physicists, which are really very precious to us. And so what I've learned through this process because we've got a project in the south of China with the same research team with a very different climate, because in the south of China it's more of a tropical climate, or subtropical climate rather, and it may be the preservation priorities may be different, particularly in terms of water treatment and ventilation. There are also differences with European architecture when we have a fairly reduced level of permeability in order to maintain the interior environment. But in these kind of wooden frameworks that we have in China, often there is a natural approach of ventilation, but new technologies interrupt the natural approaches that are there and can lead to mold. And it's important for teams to learn from other skills, to learn from the building technicians, and to learn about passive and active means. And so what you can see in terms of the result of very well preserved items here, this is the result of surveys of research, but also assisted ventilation, which is well hidden in order to measure the situation. Next slide, please. So this is the plan, just to help you to understand, because you know the general plan of Versailles very well. So I'm not going to show that to you. But here's a small part of the Forbidden City Palace, and this a real summary of Chinese architecture here, with buildings built around the central courtyard. With things might be more complex with the emperor, with some areas dedicated for the emperor, some areas dedicated for women and for other groups of populations. So this is perhaps more complex for the emperors, but it's sort of standard Chinese architecture. And the options that we put in place here are very different in the north, with frequent freezing, approaching freezing level in the winter, and in the south, our research projects are showing that it's about 15 degrees in the winter, but there are also issues of water rising up in the walls, but the treatment is different because they're very different microclimates here. Next slide, please. So in order to show you another example, I was on a study visit in Japan, and we saw some sites which have a very high number of visitors, and so there's wear and tear on the building, and so the team took this photo in Temple Kotechi in Kyoto. The next slide. So, and here we have it's very open. There's no climate control, because it's very open through the authenticity and these spaces that are very open towards the outside, the strategies that have been adopted by conservators to try and welcome as many people as possible, and also preserve this fragile structure. In a similar way with the Imperial Palace, we spoke with archaeologists and conservators, and there is an examination that's carried out 3 times a week. There's a monthly maintenance, there's a quarterly meeting, and every year there are maintenance programs that are put in place for things that are identified throughout the year. And so maintenance is really key for preserving these spaces. And this means that there's the conservation part, but something that really touched me when I traveled both in China and Japan is that these sites are also cultural spaces which teach children and future generations something about the heritage of a way of life. Is coming to visit these palaces, a bit like Versailles perhaps, is to enable children and visitors to experience. So this is a photo where a girl is taking water from a fountain next to the temple, and people can imagine about this traditional way of living with nature, indoors and outdoors. in order to present something a bit different, we've been visiting tropical zones for a number of years where we have other conservation strategies. I can show you an example here on Reunion Island, which I visited last November. This is the historic museum. It's a historic house which is open onto a French-style garden, of course, in a tropical climate. And in order to have the ideal conditions for preserving this historic house, we can see that all the shutters are closed and only no more than 20 people can go inside the building. So very few people are actually able to visit the building, which creates another option in terms of museography. And this I found really very interesting because this is in front of the Departmental Museum in Bilel. And so with this climate, this tropical climate, and since they have a real museum program for commemorating slavery in that area, while they're waiting for that program to be developed, the summary of the visit, including the introduction, is carried out outside underneath the tree. There's been no architecture or no energy required to welcome these people. We're just in the garden and we just stay for about 20 minutes or so here, and then we go round the house, and then afterwards you go around the garden. So I thought this was interesting, both for visitors and from a cultural perspective, but also it conserves the house. It may not be ideal for the fact that it's very closed and it's very not open very frequently. This is a problem for visitors, but it's due to the conditions. But I thought it was really interesting to have this other approach. From my architectural perspective, it's a very special approach, I think. Next slide, please. So since I don't have very much time, I just wanted to show you this photo that I took in Shanghai. And this is on the 7th floor of a stone pagoda, which contains one of the oldest temples of Shanghai. And you can see the city being transformed beyond it, which corresponds to a master plan that we're involved in our agency. And this temple is part of an urban survey over a 10 square kilometer area. And so we can see that the respect of this this lifestyle, of this way of life that has lasted for about 600 years now, and this is an Oriental, Chinese and Japanese approach to have this transparency between inside and outside with the space of the monument and the space of the city. This could inspire future generations through these kind of exhibitions that happen outside, while also having the monuments that stay at the heart of our cultural values. So I was an urbanist working on this site. I took this photo and we really have tried to maintain the scale of this temple. We've tried to develop an urban program. The pagoda is 35 meters high. It's still very clearly visible on the skyline because everything around it is the space around it, and there's a real success here in terms of integrating this, and we're very happy about the way that we've managed to integrate it into our contemporary city life. And I'm very happy to have your questions. Thank you very much, Ning Liu, for this presentation, which has taken us a long way, but also brought us very close. And this tells us that we can think about strategies for visiting and also think about traditional methods. And this, of course, connects into the framework that we create for visits and the comfort that we put in place for visitors in this context. You've also reminded us, and this connects in well with what Anne was saying in the introduction, or Annelies was also talking about. It also talks about the importance of interdisciplinary teams. And we can see that by listening to these interdisciplinary teams and working with them, you've been able to develop relevant strategies. And actually, we should again remind ourselves of the fundamental role of the architect in this program and in this strategy, in this overall systemic strategy, which is really very important. I think that we will perhaps save some time for questions, and then I suggest that we perhaps pass on to Laurent Ricard, who will talk to us about another territory in the north of France. And we wanted to wrap up this series of presentations with a presentation from the Conservation Center of the Louvre Museum in Liévin, which was built by and was built in order to take into account environmental issues in its design and in its daily operation. And then after that, we'll have time to talk and discuss afterwards. So Laurent, I will perhaps just introduce you first. Laurent Ricard is head of the Building and Security Department of the Louvre's Conservation Center in Liévin. He has a degree in climate and electrical engineering. After 5 years in a fluid engineering consultancy specializing in cultural facilities, he joined the Louvre Museum as project manager for the construction of the Musee's graphic spaces of the Islamic Arts Department. In 2018, he joined the teams for the construction of the center and to prepare the operation and maintenance thereof. Since the facility has been commissioned in 2019, the issues of climate control, preventive conservation are at the heart of his daily work.
Thank you, Hélène, for this introduction. We're in a very different context. We're not working in a historic or built heritage. We're working with a new building which has been built to purpose from the offset. And you will be able to see on the following slide that this was a request from the offset from programmers. Information was provided to the architects, and that played a very important role. There was a dialogue with architects, which was very significant, and it was a successful dialogue between the contractor, the project owner, the different users, the future operator, the programmers, the architect. There was a real success for dialogue between the different players in this project. Let me remind you now of some objectives. So we wanted to have an envelope that had significant air tightness and humidity, stability of humidity as much as possible. We wanted a thermal insulation. This was implemented, and I will be talking about that later on in my presentation. We wanted to have rainwater management systems installed. As we saw earlier in the previous presentation, this can lead to difficulties associated with the environment. So we wanted a comfortable temperature and humidity levels for both the works and people, visual comfort as well, with natural light and artificial light. An important point that I will come back to later is performance tools. So the BMS, the Building Management System, which is a centralized system, that's very important and should not be forgotten. It really does allow us to monitor what's going on in our buildings. It is perhaps not perfect yet what we have, but it's excellent for monitoring and having alarms and warning systems in place for climate in order to monitor the entire building remotely and maintain it as needed. As we heard earlier, maintenance is another key point that we need to consider. On this next slide, you can see a very representative drawing between the programmatic picture on the left by Frédéric Ladonne, and on the right, you can see the real project where it has really translated our request to have a central stock room, but with a lot around the stock room, and to have space to move around. We wanted a welcome center, office space, a logistics area, and they really have translated this fully. It's been very successful. Once again, I do not hold shares in this architectural firm, but they really did meet our needs with limiting the amount of empty space as well. There's been real thought put into it after 3.5 years. Nobody's got lost in this building. There's not a multitude of spaces where you have to move around. There are doors, obviously, for security, safety, and climate reasons. But we have had a number of guided tours. No one has said to us, I don't understand how this building works, and it has been very successful. On the next slide now about the architectural concept, there has been a landscaping integration that's this is semi-built into the ground in order to use the natural land which has been removed. We've had earthworks in order to remove, extract some of the soil in order to then replace that soil around the building in order to use this inertia. One important part of the project about inertia was to have a greened roof over 18 square meters, which had different layers of leak tightness. We had 3 leak tightness layers across the entire building, in addition to a leak detection system. And this has, through this inertia, this has given us a lot of benefits. So let me go back to the significant integration in the environment and the landscape of the site, because this has given us significant energy performance. We saw this when we commissioned this building in July 2019. We saw record-breaking heat in the Hauts-de-France region, with 42 degrees Celsius between midday and 1 p.m. We had 20 degrees in the stock rooms with specific conditions. Air conditioning was not yet activated as we were still in a works stage. And most of the doors were open because of this work stage as well. And we saw the temperature rise by about 2 to 3 degrees without any air conditioning. So inertia obviously has its limits, but you could see that it was playing a significant role. On the next slide, you can see a number of examples of this landscape integration. With the images you have on the left and on the right-hand side, you can see that these spaces are very green. We have 4 hectares of land with a large roof as well. And we've also planted trees all around the site in order to create a kind of green arc. This was wanted from 2018. On the right-hand side, you can see that we're in the continuity of a park nearby. On the bottom left, you can see the end bit of this Parc de Vallouance. And there's around 12 to 15% of it that is not accessible to the public for safety reasons, and this has been integrated perfectly. On the next slide, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but you can see the consumption of electricity and water. From the offset, we wanted to talk about all of our different consumption, because there's climate control, but there's also computers, there's lighting, and a number of different things keeping the building running. On the first chart, you can see the consumption of 932,160 for all different uses. This is not a year of reference because of COVID. We had restricted activity. We were still in the launch phase. We opened in October 2019. So our consumption was reduced. So the reference year would be 2021, where we had significant removals. The studios were all used, where we had 1.3 million kilowatt hours in consumption. I will be coming back to how we did this later, but we used a number of different levers to reduce this by 13.5%. So we think that this is a real success. And we have been tackling our consumption through a number of different ways. If you can see look at the breakdown now on the right-hand side, the pie chart. We have split up our use where we have 75% of our consumption, which is for the production of hot and cold water for humidity purposes, for heating, cooling, 9% for electricity, for different workstations and servers, 15% for lighting, and then 1% for miscellaneous equipment. And on the bottom left, you can see around 50% of consumption, which is linked to our stock rooms, which is about half of the surface area of the building, so it makes sense. Let me move quickly now into water consumption on the bottom right-hand side. So we have around 600 cubic meters. And we have 38% for our humidifiers, 34% for toilets, for various uses, cleaning, and 21% is also cleaning and technical areas in the building. Once again, across these 600 cubic meters, we've managed to reduce that by 8.8% between 2021 and 2022, despite this period of drought. We are not watering the grass outside. We're letting nature be. We have a roof treatment that's for meadows. So we really do let nature just do its thing. And then once a year, we take care of it. We don't have grass that's cut once a week so that it's aesthetically beautiful. For biodiversity, we're actually leaving nature be. We're considering putting beehives onto our site as well. And that will be a project for later on this year, unless I'm mistaken. On this next slide, as I said in my introduction, I was talking about comfort. So for lighting, we have a very large windows on one side of the building, as you can see, as you could see on the picture. We also, from the programmers, we had LED lighting, and we wanted natural light in order to provide greater comfort for users. On the bottom left, you can see that there is a light panel in the roof, which allows us not to turn on the lights when we don't need to. In the main area, we have LED lighting that changes depending on the external light. So there's a grading of this light depending on the needs, which is based on the external lighting. I can see that we don't have much time left. I will try to go quicker. So let me talk about some of the actions that we can carry out every single day. I'm not going to go into detail for all of them, but two important points that I think it's worth mentioning is that we regularly raise awareness of users not to leave doors open, for instance, to turn lights off when we leave a meeting room or an office space. That's very important. We have also successfully been working on an example like at the Palais. We stop some of our hot and cold water at the weekend, and this is significantly saving energy with our air circulation during that time as well. We have been monitoring consumption pretty much daily with our maintenance team in order to quickly identify any issues. I'm going to try to wrap up shortly, but we have climate monitoring in order to reduce our consumption with our technical management of the building, a second control system to ensure that climate monitoring, is carried out every couple of years. We work on the maintenance of this system as it provides orders for the rest of our systems. It's not been used in other institutions to have this regular climate assessment, but we do think that it is worth it. The second point I would like to mention is that the digital simulations carried out on ventilation, we have air treatment, recycled air with 0.3% air rate. So we don't have any members of the public in this space. So in other institutions, there's between 3 to 5%. So we want to have a very low rate in order to ensure air uniformity within the spaces. My final point, and I'm not going to go over time, this is about waste management. We have tried to reduce our quantity of waste through recycling. We try to recycle the wood from the packages internally in order to reuse it for other boxes. So alternatively, we recycle it. Let me share an anecdote with you now. It's still significant for smokers. We have a recycling system for cigarette butts. In 2022, we saved 6,500 cubic meters of water pollution through cigarette butts thrown into nature, which could potentially pollute the various groundwater sources around our site. We filter all of our rainwater on the site as well. And our groundwater supply allows us to produce hot and cold water through heat pumps. So this recycled rainwater is used in order to produce hot and cold water. Please do ask any questions that you want to. I will try to answer them quickly, but I do apologize if I'm a little chatty on these topics.
Thank you, Laurent. So we wanted to leave a bit of time for questions. We've got about 10 minutes left altogether now. And we can use that time to just respond to what's been presented. And thank you very much again for these presentations. Perhaps in response to the comment from our colleague at the University of Quebec, who says, is the reconsideration of standards for conservation, is it a real upheaval of practices, or is it just a case of an adjustment in progress? Annelies or Danilo, on this question of the fundamental review of our practices, you probably partially responded to this already, but perhaps you would like to add something. I think is a real issue that should be revolutionary, because changing standards and set points will have a very significant impact on the dimensioning of machines, the consumption of energy, the monitoring of collections. So when there are more parameters to follow, that involves more risk, of course. And then in terms of climate change, we could imagine, for example, an increase in temperatures, for example, and we might have to have specific adjustments for visitors, and staff would try to perhaps lower temperatures in the winter, and then we would also need to perhaps cool rooms in the summer for rooms that need that to compromise or the lack of heat, as it were, that we don't use in the winter. And these are the sorts of questions that we're asking ourselves at the moment, which are really very important. Thank you, Danilo. Annelies, over to you, because I think you need to leave us at 7 o'clock straight away. Yes, indeed. I'm about to walk out the door, but we can see that sometimes it is very complicated with the climate declaration. We've talked to a lot of museums, and we've had the museums that have signed, and we've managed to receive a lot of comments, and these comments are of all different types. Some historical buildings that would say to us, this is quite strict, and they don't really give figures. It's more of a sort of a way of thinking about guidelines. Others in more traditional museums with a lot of loans think that this isn't actually very strict, what we set out in the climate declaration, but we can see that things are improving. I think there is a change of attitude, but we haven't yet really fully achieved that, because sometimes things are changing not always for good reasons. Sometimes people change set points for bad reasons, sometimes for good reasons. Everything depends on the staff. What we understand is that we always need education in terms of what the real risks are, in terms of the building, in terms of the collection, because the buildings also can be damaged if things are adapted in a way that's not appropriate for a specific building. So we try to be aware of the different advantages and the disadvantages, and there are often intermediaries between the engineering practices and the architects, who sometimes have very good experience with historical buildings, and other times they don't, and also the system maintenance people. And so these two documents that we have are fairly comprehensible for all parties, and this helps the different groups to understand one another. Thank you very much. Perhaps I could add something. I think what we see in common between all the presentations is that it's important not just to work with systematic set points, but to adapt them in terms of the conservation of pieces and their state of conservation. This is something that we also see with the EPICO program, that we need to really follow and monitor the works and really work and adapt to the condition of these works and really understand the status of their conservation and also the envelope, the architecture. We need to understand as well traditional methods, which sometimes involves archaeology, which we heard about in order to better understand the techniques and help us to understand passive techniques, which doesn't necessarily need the use of air conditioning. So it's about using our buildings, understanding our buildings, and ensuring that they are adaptive and evolutive. This work also involves dissemination, as is what you're doing, and I'd like all of you to perhaps comment on this. Danilo, Laurent, Annelies, Ning Liu, you do this work in different events and that you run, and we'd really like you to be able to send the links for the different projects that you've mentioned. And perhaps Danilo, you could say something about the Espadon project. You mentioned it very briefly, but this would be something that's also very interesting. Perhaps if each of you could mention one or two initiatives linked into your subject, current events, perhaps for this summer or in the autumn or the beginning of 2024, so it's events that could be useful in terms of these issues that we're talking about. Yeah, please do, Danilo. I don't know if I'm the best person to talk about Espadon, because we want to be compatible with Espadon. This is a big national project from the Ministry of Research and Innovation with the Ministry of Culture, and this is something that should enable us to ensure that all our databases for our collections and also architecture are interoperable. And so what I want to do is to make the most of this big project, this wonderful project, to find a solution to the multitude of data that we have between the different databases for maintenance, for dust, for information in terms of decoration and architecture and light. And I want to make the most of new technology and think about what we can do with EPICO in the context of Espadon in order to do the best to bring together all this data and have a cross-cutting view of all this data at a local level in terms of a focus on a specific object, and then going up the scales at a chateau level and then a national level and even an international level. I don't know if I've explained that properly, but it's a very ambitious and complex project, which is really very exciting and will open up a lot of opportunities for us if we succeed in dealing with it properly. I think Pascal Liovo would like to say something. I can see that Pascal is here. Yes, thank you. Thank you, Danilo, for talking about this project, which is very important for the Ministry of Culture. And the Ministry of Culture is very involved in here in order to use augmented technology. And also, this fits into a European framework as part of a call for projects launched by the European Commission for the construction of a European cloud of heritage. And this is a really very ambitious project. There's currently a consortium that's being developed, that has been put in place and is seeking to respond to this call. This is a consortium with a Franco-Italian partnership. And I really do hope that the consortium will succeed in winning this call for projects, because the project is seeking to ensure a good sharing of data between heritage institutions and researchers in order to conserve them in the long term, in order to make them comparable and interoperable. And also what's interesting is to maintain the sovereignty of these data, because this is something that the big five internet companies are working on in particular. And sometimes we have working with institutions that don't have the resources of, say, the Château of Versailles, and this would give them tools that are shared and that would make it possible for them to have a smart management in a long-term and sustainable way of this heritage data, so that they can share the data not only at a national but also at a European level. And since I've got the mic for a moment, I could just also mention something else which is connected into what we're talking about today, and really thank you to the presenters today, because it's really been very interesting what you've presented. We are developing between the French Ministry of Culture and the Italian Ministry of Culture, and in partnership, as Danilo knows, we are working on research and information in cultural heritage, and there are a series of seminars that are being developed. Ann Bourgès is taking part in one of these seminars that brings together researchers from France and Italy, and the first theme of the first wave is to do with heritage and ecological transitions, and the next date that people can join in remotely, the next date is the 20, hang on, let me just check the date. It's the 27th of June in the morning. And if you send me your contact details, or if I can get the mailing list, yes, we'll send the information around ICOM France. I haven't yet got a link for registration, but Helen, I could send that over to you when I have it. That would be really very interesting because it's a really good way of comparing perspectives on this very interesting area for different countries. Ning Liu, you wanted to say something, I think, just before we wrap up? I'll try to be very brief. I think this is a really interesting discussion, and I would really want to encourage my architect colleagues to join us, but also the conservation and restoration of museums and palaces could create spaces for conservation of works, and that requires specific techniques and training, because it's a specific way of doing this. And with our work that we've done in tropical countries in China and Japan, we see that technology is really essential for managing internal and external spaces, especially when spaces are not impermeable, they're not waterproofed. It's even more difficult because when there is active measured ventilation, when the doors are open, this actually, we are at a good period of history, because through simulation methods and monitoring, and also through surveys in terms of museum use, we can do this. And so this summer we are doing a training course in the south of China, in Yangtze, on the architecture of Earth, and this is open to students from fourth year of studies, masters and doctoral students who are interested in heritage. And we've managed to get a budget from from a university here. I am trying to get more and more budget to organize this kind of workshop online and on site in the future, and I will send the information to Ann Bourgès if there are young people listening to us today from the museums who would be interested in this. This could create some interesting networking opportunities. In terms of what we're doing, as Laurent has just said, we are going to try to bring experts working in specific areas to more rural areas where they need these heritage restoration techniques, but they don't have these expert teams. So they're going to come and see what solutions would be appropriate, while taking into account, of course, the climate differences. Thank you very much for listening to me. Well, Ning Liu, come and join us at the CCL whenever you like. That would be great to keep talking about these subjects. We'll see you again. Anne, would you like to say anything to wrap up, or is there anything else that we need to say? Perhaps I could just respond very quickly to what Ning Liu has said in terms of training. We have identified within our DRI, but also with other institutes, we've identified training courses which are important to include, and we are working on identifying these traditional techniques which we've all talked about today, linked into climates and all regions in different countries. Ning Liu showed this for China, but this also applies to France. And we need to see that within different regions there are different climates, and these different climates require different types of archaeology which need to be handled in different ways in terms of management of heat, etc. These are things that all need to be identified in interdisciplinary ways. And it's important to include this in training of architects so that it can be taken into account in terms of design aspects of museums that can be taken into account from the beginning. So thank you very much. Another point that I think is really interesting this evening is that we've talked about the contribution of new technologies and the contribution of research in these areas. This will be one of the themes in our series that we'll be looking at, I think, Emily, in the autumn. So this is an area that we'll be looking at again later on. So just to conclude, I invite you to take part in the next session, which will be focused on mediation, cultural outreach through exhibitions, but also the tools that we make available to audiences and the public to help them become aware of these issues for all different kinds of museums and different collections. This will be on the 7th of June, Emily. I think that's right. And we're really glad to see you then. Thank you very much for being with us this evening and for these really interesting discussions. Thank you very much. We'll see you again soon. That's right. The next session will be on the 7th of June, and then on the 27th of September will be the session for research and training. Thank you very much to everyone. Thank you to Hélène. Thank you to Anne for your moderation. Don't hesitate to send all the information about these different this series around, and people can watch back the video from tonight as well. And please do invite people to come to the next meeting on the 7th of June. Thank you very much. Have a good evening. Thank you. Good evening and goodbye.